Hello, everyone. This is Frank from Heritage, Ohio. We're just getting everything set and ready to go, so we'll get started here in just a moment. Thanks for your patience.
Okay, I'm ready to start. Hello, I'm Joyce Barrett, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Webinars are brought to you through the generosity of the supporters and members of Heritage Ohio. Heritage Ohio's mission is to help people save the places that matter, build community, and live better. We hope you'll consider joining our organization and making a difference. In your handouts box on the right side control panel, the PowerPoint slides are attached, which at the end they have listed critical resources. In the chat box, we have a link to sign up for AIA HSW credits. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please type it into the question box at any time, and we will get to them. If you're having any issues with the webinar software, these are most often solved if you close the program and restart it with the link that was sent to you. Later this afternoon, GoToWebinar will send you a link to the recording of this webinar. Today, our presentation is on ADA accessibility and historic buildings. I'm so pleased to have Elizabeth Corbin Murphy and Alice Sloan of Prospectus Architecture from Cleveland and Akron. Elizabeth Corbin Murphy, Prospectus Principal, is an AIA Ohio gold medal architect dedicated to preservation and restoration technology and design. She consults with building owners and architects regarding state and federal rehabilitation tax credits, design related to old or historic structures, detailed restoration specifications, historic interiors, and design guidelines for historic urban centers. Alice Sloan is a technical preservation specialist with a broad portfolio of experiences in technical assessment, historic preservation research, and condition assessments for proposed adaptive reuse, rehabilitation, and restoration projects. With that, I will hand it over the presentation to Elizabeth and Alice.
Good afternoon. I think that you see in front of you our AIA learning objectives. Now, we're going to spend just a little bit of time on the history and evolution of the Architectural Barriers Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, so that you can understand a little bit about how they fit into the area of regulations. We're also going to identify the types of projects that trigger additional accessibility requirements and that should be designed in your project. We also want to spend some good time talking about what happens if you have a small project, a partial rehab project that is affected by building codes and accessibility and universal design. And a big question a lot of people have is, when is an elevator suggested, recommended, or required in a Main Street storefront project? Again, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat box. We have lots of time for questions, and we are willing to do our best to answer them. Okay, so what we really want to know is, when does ADA kick in? There we go. Sorry, I had a momentary mute issue. So today's goal, we were asked to address these questions because Heritage Ohio has a special revitalization grant that they are in the midst of finding proper applicants. The Paul Brune Historic Revitalization Grants are federally funded. So what did that mean for the people who are using them in regard to ADA? So we are addressing this somewhat in direct relationship to the Paul Brune grants, but also most everything that we are talking about today applies to any federally funded source. And we can go into the sources later if you like. Right now, we're just going to try to see if we can't keep a straight path on the goal to simplify the approach to preservation and accessibility decision making. We're not going to tell you how far the toilet has to be from the wall today. We're going to talk about decision making in regard to accessibility. We want to demonstrate how to make these decisions impacting and controlling the scope of your work, especially for accessibility. Now, the slide you see here is the sheriff's residence in St. Clairsville, the Belmont County Sheriff's residence, and that's an after picture. So they were able to keep all of the historic steps to the building because we were able to find accessible means to reach the building, to reach the entries, and to navigate the entire building. So the first thing we want to address just momentarily is the eligibility for federal rehabilitation grants. This again will apply to the Paul Brune grants and other federal grants. It will also make a difference in the building code if you are a certified historic structures. Now, specifically for the Paul Brune grants, the building in question must be a certified historic structure. The certified historic structures include individual buildings listed on the National Register of Historic Places. They also include individual buildings or groups of buildings that are considered contributing to an historic district that is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Sometimes federal funding may be contingent upon buildings even being eligible, but for today's discussion, we're talking about certified historic structures that are indeed listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So why is accessibility important? You know, these two subjects seem so different, talking about historic structures and talking about accessibility. But accessibility really is important, and it needs to be a mindset of anyone who's working on their business, growing their business, or working on their properties. According to the CDC, 25.6% of adults in the US have some type of disability. And you can see here on this slide, we talk about the different types of disabilities or classifications in the US, and that's mobility, cognitive disabilities, people who are not capable of independent living. And then there's the really common ones in my mind are vision and hearing. And then there's that other category that we don't even seem to be talking about here, and that's those that are temporarily disabled. If any of you have ever had a sprained ankle and needed to navigate on a pair of crutches. So we need to think about that type of accommodation for everybody and to welcome everybody as much as we can possibly do that. I also want to make it really clear that accessibility is good business. We just talked about 25% of adults having some kind of disability. So do you want to start with only 75% of a possible customer base? That doesn't sound like good business. So giving 100% of your customers the ability to work with you is the best way to do it. Not always possible to get everybody into every spot, but let's talk about what can be done and easily done. So if you look at this floor plan, in order to get into this restaurant, everybody, absolutely everybody, had to go up 4 or 5 stairs. While 4 or 5 stairs are not too much of an imposition for most people, it was not difficult in this situation to put in a small lift. It takes up the space of about 3 foot by 4 foot, and that way we're back up to 100% of our customers who can possibly do business with us. And it's not a big investment. We're not talking throughout today about a burdensome investment. We're talking about what can be achieved within the realm of reason in our historic structures. Okay, so what triggers or tempers accessibility regulations? The goal here was to talk about ABA and ADA. So let's look at how those pieces of legislation became part of our everyday operations. The Architectural Barriers Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act are civil rights legislation. The Fair Housing Act was actually passed first in 1964, and in 1968, right before the Architectural Barriers Act, the Fair Housing Act became important to buildings themselves. Now, in the Fair Housing Act are a lot of things that have to do with equal rights to mortgages and non-discrimination in banking, and you can't turn a person down who wants to buy a house depending on their color. So in 1968, it also meant that you can't turn a person down because of their disability, solely on their disability. So those pieces of legislation began to affect first the government structures, and as in the Architectural Barriers Act, and then the private structures. So we needed to be thinking about being able to allow people into our buildings, to provide for workers who are disabled, to provide for customers who are disabled. And all of this is under the umbrella of civil rights legislation. So how does that get incorporated into buildings? So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. The National Historic Preservation Act was passed 2 years after the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. And it began to address the actual physical conditions of buildings. In the National Historic Preservation Act, there was a relationship with ADA, the Americans with Disabilities, or I'm sorry, with the Barriers Act. And in the National Historic Preservation Act, it gave the right to consider that historic integrity had to be viewed on the same level as other federal regulations. Now, where does that put us? Does that put us halfway between the building code and civil rights legislation and preservation? In a sense, yes, it did. And it required some evolution of building codes and requirements for disabilities to shake themselves out. So at the bottom of this one, I have the Ohio Building Code. Now, I quote the Ohio Building Code because I'm sitting in Ohio, but the Ohio Building Code Chapter 34 was actually a model chapter for other building codes across the country on how you address existing conditions in certified historic structures, but also in old and existing buildings. The Ohio Building Code is based on the International Building Code. Most current is OBC 2017, based on the IBC from 2 years earlier. And Ohio Building Code is state legislation. So you can say that the National Historic Preservation Act outweighs the Ohio Building Code, and so does the Americans with Disabilities Act. But the building codes are so much better at integrating all of the requirements that it is much easier now to meet requirements than it was previously. So we look forward to the discussion of how these things balance each other. So I did want you just briefly to look at these photos. The above photo, equal rights now in housing, decent housing, those protests were effective. The one below it, trying to save Pennsylvania Station in New York, was not effective. That building got torn down and people are still mourning it. So let's hope that as we work on our decisions for how you treat your own individual historic building, we can think about historic integrity and about equal rights and about code and safety and health for all people. Okay, so after all that, who, what, where, when, why, and how, we have all these questions. What are we going to do? So when I was a teenager, my mother used to ask me all of those questions. If I could not answer every one of those questions, I was not allowed to go out. So I had to think about it before I went to ask her. And that's what we're going to suggest to you today, that we think about it. So are there guidelines to walk us through all these disparate sets of regulations? That would be guidelines to find accessibility for historic properties. So I will tell you, yes, there are guidelines. There's guidelines. There's more guidelines than you probably would want to look at, and they each have their own little niche. Some properties, depending on their chicken soup or their stone soup of funding sources, are required to look at all of these sets of guidelines. So I'm just going to go through them just briefly, and then we will we'll talk about them, about how to make the decisions based on what your project is. So the first one is the Americans with ADAG. We can say ADAG, too many alphabets. The Americans with Disabilities Act Accessibility Guidelines. So that is a group of guidelines that were developed as a demonstration for how you could meet accessibility requirements. The American National Standards Institute also has guidelines, but their guidelines are written on an individual basis. So they'll have a guideline for how to test concrete, and they'll have a guideline for how to put in a grab bar. But it is not an overall set of guidelines that you could just pick up and say, when do I use these? How do I use these? The American National Standards Institute provides their written documents, and they have numbers attached to them, and many of the building codes will refer specifically to one of the ANSI standards for each individual piece they would like for you to follow. Universal design is really a philosophy of opening buildings for all people. So for instance, if you're doing housing and you want to apply universal design, the idea would be, in addition to the units that you have set up for handicapped accessibility, all of your units would have used some or all of the aspects of universal design so that you could welcome a guest, for instance, who came in a wheelchair. So the concept of universal design is while there are numbers attached to it, it is a philosophy of opening your home, your business, your place of work to all people. Section 504 is a standard that applies to most projects that are funded through the housing and urban development. The Section 504 really applies for the projects that are larger, and it has some interesting pieces to it. So for instance, if you're making changes to any one unit, each change you make must meet accessibility guidelines until you have reached a point of having 5% of all of your units that meet the accessibility code. So if you decided to change the doors out in all of your building, in all of your units in your building, then you would be required to change the doors to meet accessibility codes until you had 5% of the units that met met all of the requirements in the building or in the guide. Section 504 of the 1973 Rehab Act really prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities by any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, or by any program or activity conducted by a federal executive agency or the post office. So that one seems like a very heavy burden, but it most often does not apply to Main Street projects, partly because of their scale and partly because of how they achieve their funding. The Ohio Building Code will apply unless the changes that you are making are only like for like. So if you took out one door and put in another door, then you would not be required to lift your entire building up to code. And that's one thing that I believe is very important when you're starting to look at doing projects in your buildings, and we'll talk more about it later. And the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of properties, historic properties, provides 10 common sense guidelines that would address how you make changes in your buildings, even if it's accessibility. You would pull your accessibility guidelines in and you would see how they mesh with the Secretary of the Interior standards. Now, all of this sounds really scary, and I hope that by the end of what we're talking about today, it's not so scary anymore. Okay, where do I start? So the National Park Service, who is under the Secretary of the Interior, has a lot of technical support available for those who are rehabilitating their historic structures. And their recommendations for accessibility in your historic property have 3, hopefully, common sense steps to follow. One is review the historic significance of the property, identifying the character-defining features. So let's say you had a downspout on the back of the building and it was in the way of wheelchair access and you had to move it. Is that going to upset the integrity of your historic property? Not likely. Not likely. So those kinds of things we don't need to worry about. So what you want to do in your first step is to look at what are the historically significant pieces of the property and how can we best protect them while we make any changes in the building. So number 2 would be to assess the property's existing and required levels of accessibility. And we're going to go into that a bit more. And when I'm done with all of this, then Alice is going to come on and show you 3 case studies and how they addressed these issues on a Main Street level. The third one is to evaluate the accessibility options within the preservation context. So for instance, if you have a tiny building, is it reasonable to put an elevator in it? Am I required to put an elevator in it? We'll talk about that too. Okay, so on this building, I want to talk about scope of work and I want to talk about labels and things that can work in your favor and things that you can get yourself in trouble with if you're not careful. So this is the historic Smith Orr residence in Orrville. It's residential, right? So we shouldn't have any problem with these requirements, right? Well, let's define the scope of work. We are choosing to make enough changes that we can, instead of using this house as a residence, we can use it as a house museum. Now, a museum is assembly use. So we are switching from it being a residence to being an assembly use under the building code. So that puts us into number 2, understand your occupancy label and your change of occupancy. If you're moving from residential into an assembly use, then you have triggered a building code review. Okay, and that would mean even if you were only making minor changes. So we need to think about occupancy labels and the change of occupancy. It's not a bad thing. It's all working towards the health, safety, and welfare of the people that you bring into the structure. So there will be some requirements when you change use. Now, on a lot of your Main Street projects, where they have retail on the first floor and office or residential on the second, and they've been that way for 100 years, and you're going to keep it that way, then you don't have a change of use. However, if you're choosing to change how you use the building, it does fall into this category, labeling the change of occupancy. The next thing that's really important to understand as you're working on your project is that you need to know what is a substantial alteration as it applies to your project. And there's not really a magic answer. So the substantial alteration, it has a formula if you are going for federal rehabilitation tax credits. There is a formula. You must meet the adjusted basis of the property. So that would be the value of the property minus the land. In other words, what's the value of the building, market rate value? Or $5,000 minimum if your substantial if your adjusted basis is less than 5,000. You must spend a minimum of 5,000. Now, that's for tax credits. The other ways of measuring substantial alterations would have to do with the building code and how much are you changing and how much can you control within your change. So for instance, if we went back to the front door example I used in the last one, that would not be considered a substantial alteration. So what you want to be careful of is that you're very distinctly defining your scope of work. So let's say we are upgrading the rear entry. We're going to restore the windows on the front of the facade and upgrade the rear entry. And we're going to make sure there's no leaks in the roof. And so that's the limits of our project. So what you need to then do is to be wary of scope creep. That's number 4 here. So we very carefully defined what is going to be in our project as the front facade and the rear entry and the roof, and we're not doing anything else to the inside. So the building code would allow us to make those changes without addressing much of ADA except the front and rear entries, because those are part of the facades. But there would be no restrooms, no elevator, no housing issues, no anything else if we stick to our scope of work. But let's say you have this facade and roof program, but you've got the contractor on the site, and shouldn't he just build you a new checkout desk? And while he's at it, shouldn't he put in a new restroom? So you have just increased your alterations, and those things must meet code. So it's really important, if you want to control how you're spending your money, to define your scope of work and to understand what it means when you choose to do something different. So with the Smith-Orr house, it went from residential to assembly, and it required accessibility, and it required restrooms, and those became part of the project. Holly, can you go to the next one? There we go. Okay, so what do I do now? Access to public properties is required. Access to properties open to the public is highly encouraged, including the landscape. Now, I want to draw a distinction there. If it's public property, if it's owned by the federal government or the county government, the access is required. Access to the properties that are open to the public is highly encouraged, and if any changes are made, for instance, the ones we talked about with change of occupancy, then access is required by the building code, because the building code would kick in. Access to private properties is required with substantial change. And historic structures can increase their accessibility while minimizing changes to significant materials and features. So you got to put all of those things together, and the Smith-Orr house is a great example of that. Now, this photo shows you during construction, and it shows you how it was necessary to get people in the front door, but no one wanted to alter the approach to the front door. You see there are steps there that are historic stone. And so what we did in this case was to use grass pavers. So you see that the dark gray material, those look like egg crates turned upside down, and they're strong enough to drive a fire truck over. So when that is fully grown in, the grass comes right through the grass pavers, and you don't even notice that the grass pavers are there. So the previous slide that we looked at already had grown in and shown you how we have wheelchair access to the front porch and therefore to the front door. So there are lots of ways to address accessibility without hurting the integrity of your historic structure. And it just requires a little imagination, a little fortitude, and some good hard work at in the idea stage, so, which is another reason I really stress that if you look at your scope of work at the very beginning of your project, you can define how to best address the project. Okay, so are accessibility updates required? So let's say you haven't done anything to your building. Can somebody make the building accessible? Well, first of all, I would like to say we'd like a little bit of an attitude shift in that we want our buildings to be accessible. We want access to 100% of our customers all the time. So that's the goal for everybody, but how does it work? So the scope of work determines what is addressed for accessibility unless, because the Americans with Disabilities Act is civil rights legislation, lawsuits can require accessibility alterations to a public building. We used to see lawsuits happen all the time because of this, but now people are so much more cognizant of how to make buildings accessible and how important it is to make buildings accessible that I believe that the instances of lawsuits are going down and the voluntary consideration of accessibility is much greater than it used to be. Unfortunately, that's often the way we make change. The government says, we're going to do it, it's required in public buildings, and you're going to follow us eventually. So there is sometimes a lag between the example that is set by our government and by how we address it. And hopefully it doesn't require lawsuits. But we have worked on several buildings whose projects were spurred by the threat of lawsuit. So can lawsuits affect your building? Yes, they could affect your building because anybody can file a lawsuit at any time. But generally, old and historic buildings have different responses than public buildings. And no, I'm saying this and I am going to give you some ideas, but I'm not an attorney. I am showing you how an architect responds to these types of issues. And so if you really need legal advice, I am not the person to turn to for that. So in this building, I'm sorry, can you go back just one more, please? In this building, this photos from the Cuyahoga County Courthouse. And we upgraded the restrooms and the courtrooms so that people could get in and out. There were already elevators in the building. It's just the individual rooms were difficult to get in and out of. And so that's what you're looking at there. Thanks, Polly. Okay. Now, I told you that the National Park Service has a lot of standards on how to address historic structures. The Secretary of the Interior Standards is the basis, but the National Park Service has a lot of guidance through their technical preservation briefs, through their preservation briefs and their technical bulletins. There are a lot of good advice, a lot of examples, and frankly, it's important that if you need help, you can get it from your own government. It's wonderful. So the modification guidelines that come from the National Park Service include that. You can see here we're looking at Varsity Hall at the University of Virginia. Old building. It's an old building and an important structure on that campus. And you have a set of stairs that could probably make anyone tired, even if they are fit. So the modifications had to consider that whatever we do needs to be in scale with the property. You see how high this set of stairs is. To put a ramp in front of that building that took you up that far at a reasonable 1 to 20 or 1 to 12 rate would have that thing zigzagging back and forth 4 times in front of the building. It would be a monster. So that would not be in scale with the historic property. It needs to be visually compatible. So there are some stylistic features, and in this building it's fairly simple. So how do we address access and keep it visually compatible? And then one thing that is always helpful is, can it be reversible? If we decide later that it was a mistake to make this change, could we take it out without destroying the building? So those are 3 questions that are good to ask. Sometimes your answer might be tough, but sometimes not. Polly, you switch to the next. Thank you. So here's the solution that the architects used for Varsity Hall. It's a very simple ramp going from the raised lawn into the same first floor. It goes into a different door, but this solution is so simple and so easy to use that most people, able or not, use this new door. It does not destroy the front entry. It does not destroy the approach to the historic structure, and it provides access, very simple access to the building. Okay, so what about elevators? What do I do if I only have stairs? So we start asking some more questions about elevators and what do I do if I only have stairs? First of all, is your project a substantial alteration? So if we talk again about that project where we're looking at the front facade and the roof and a little bit of the back door to make it better, do we have to put an elevator in there? No, because we are not doing a substantial alteration. According to the building code, we are not altering the path of travel through the structure. That would begin to force us to look at accessibility within the structure. So can I keep my old elevator? So if you look at this elevator in this historic structure, it just would be a crime to say, I can't keep my old elevator. So when you're working with your building code officials, it's good to start from the position of, yes, I want to keep my old elevator if I have one. And sometimes you'll have an historic elevator that will meet all of the current requirements, and sometimes they won't. So what you'll have to do is consider which pieces of the building code have an alternative means to be met and which pieces of the code do not. So that's another reason to think about your scope right up front. How do we define this? Can I keep my old elevator? We had a project that had an elevator in it, did not meet current code, but we were allowed to upgrade it as much as could be done. And it was only a 2-story building. So the owners had to have employees that were trained as elevator operators. And those operators, so anytime anyone stepped onto that elevator, they had to have a trained operator with them. But it allowed the client to keep their existing elevator and to be able to move things up and down from first floor to second floor, from basement to first floor to second floor with their old elevator. And it didn't have to meet, it had to meet the letter of the code for the elevator, but not to be upgraded to what is the current new elevator description within the code. So is an elevator within the scale of your historic building? So if you were to look at the Smith-Orr house where we showed you the grass pavers, there's only 2 stories there. It's residential scale. When it became a place of assembly, do I need to put an elevator in there? So we're going to answer the next question first. Does your building have more than 3,000 square feet per floor on 3 or more stories? If the answer is no, you do not need to put in an elevator. So what if I have programming on the second floor? So let's talk about this, because the building code is one set of legislation, and the Americans with Disabilities Act is another set of legislation. And the 2 do not cover everything in the exact same manner. So if you have a place of assembly that is open to the public and you're not required by the building code to put in an elevator, what happens when someone comes in the front door and says, well, I wanted to go to the class on the second floor. What are you going to do for me? You need to have an answer. But in a building that small, sometimes your answer can say, if we have people who can't make it to our second floor classroom, we will move to a first floor classroom or a first floor office, or we'll go into our new adjacent building and we will have the program held there so that no one is left out of the programming. So those are options. Now, it is best to think about those as part of your scope of work. Are you going to go all the way? Or if you're only going part way, how do we handle those kinds of issues when they arise? Let's say your offices are on the second floor and someone comes in who wants to do business with someone in the office on the second floor. Maybe your proposal is that you've made a deal with the restaurant next door, and whenever you have an issue where you need to accommodate someone who's on crutches or in a wheelchair, the restaurant next door has a booth saved for you that you can reserve so that you can have your meeting in a quiet spot and still get everything done and still accommodate people with disabilities. We usually suggest to people that they think this out at the very beginning when they're talking about their scope of work, so that they do have operational responses to requests for accessibility. Again, it goes to being able to welcome all people, to being able to have access to 100% of your customers, and it goes to meeting the Americans with Disabilities Act. Holly? Okay, so I'm going to show you a couple of alternatives to an elevator if you really need vertical transportation. And these devices all come in varying colors and shapes and sizes, and some go in a shaft and some of them don't. And they have different costs associated with them. So let me show you here. This is what we call a LULA. The LULA, which is limited use, limited access lift, has a restriction of only going 2 floors. So they were first developed for residential considerations, but there are some that are now built to meet requirements for commercial and institutional use. So whereas an elevator might cost you $135,000, $160,000, $180,000 if you have to build a shaft for it, a limited use, limited access elevator can cost more in the $20,000 to $40,000 range. Now, again, I am not an expert on the costs, but these will give you some realistic figures to kind of keep in the back of your mind. So here is a lift. This is not a Lula. It does not give us a whole flight. It would give us a half a flight generally, but it works really well for getting up for a half a story. Remember, I showed you that restaurant at the very beginning who only had 5 steps to raise people. So they can use a lift. This lift has a top and a bottom, and it's pretty enclosed. Some lifts are enclosed only by guardrails. So you have a good variety of lifts, and they can go in the 7,000 to 15,000 range. And if you're trying to dress it up, I imagine whatever you dress it up with would cost a little bit more. But the lift works really well. They can be self-operated, as can the Lula. And it works particularly well if you have employees that need access to more than one level of your building, and you find it difficult to put an elevator in. Okay, the ramps, we've been using ramps forever and ever. This ramp goes the whole length of a corridor because of 3 steps at the end. This ramp is removable. Remember, we talked about how using something that's removable helps us in our historic structure. We can talk about not altering the building. So instead of tearing out the 3 historic steps and the whole historic corridor, we are able to put a ramp into the building and maintain the historic integrity of the building. Now, ramps, depending on how long they are, you could put in a short ramp on that comes in modular from anywhere from $1,500 to $5,000. But if you're building a ramp outside and you want it to match the stone base course of your building, it could cost you, $1,000 a foot. So think about, again, at the beginning of your project, think about defining your scope of work and what is it you're trying to achieve? How can you achieve it in the best, most reasonable manner for access and for historic properties of your building? So I'm showing you this chairlift. This is not ever my favorite way to access a building. I find it to be I think they work quite well in residences, in commercial structures, in retail, institutional. They are much more difficult because when someone is on this lift, nobody can use the stairs, which means there can be a jam up at the top or the bottom, and the person who's on the lift can feel so conspicuous because they recognize that they're holding up traffic, and it's not really comfortable riding on a chair that moves, unless you're a skier, I suppose. But the chairlifts work really well in residential areas, not so much in retail, even though they are allowed. So in most places they're allowed. So it's all a matter of what's feasible, what works for your specific need, what are your goals, and how did you define your scope of work? Okay, so there are several other categories to address for ADA, and we're not really going to go into them now because I need to let Alice talk. So we have communications, signage, pedestrian facilities, and rights of way. This project, I just want to show you the magnificent tile that does a very gradual slope from the sidewalk to the front door so that there's no step at the front entry. Okay, so I'm just going to run through these really quickly, and then Alice is going to show you how they work. So the Park Service gives us a suggested order of priority in your historic structures. You want to make the main or prominent public entrance accessible, including the path to the entry, if it's at all possible. Your second priority would be to provide access to the goods, services, and programs. The third thing would be to provide accessible restroom facilities, and the fourth, to create access to amenities and secondary spaces. So Alice is going to show you some case studies on how those work, and I'll stop talking for a while.
Good afternoon. I am Alice Sloan, and I am going to share with you 3 case studies of buildings listed on the National Register that utilized historic tax credits for rehabilitation. These projects were required to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, and they also addressed accessibility. So case study number 1 is the Faber building in Wooster, Ohio, which is southwest of Akron or west of Canton in northeastern Ohio. It's a 3-story commercial building constructed in 1890 and recently rehabilitated using state and federal historic rehabilitation tax credits to house the vertical runner on the first floor and apartments on the upper floors. So step 1 in that NPS, National Park Service, suggested process to assess accessibility requirements in a historic building is to review the historical significance of the property and identify the character defining features. The Faber building is contributing to the Wooster Public Square Historic District, which was listed in 1978. Its character defining features, which are shown here on the exterior front facade, are its cast iron facade, 2-story oriel window, and elaborate cornice. That storefront had to be restored. If we move on to the next slide, you will see the picture of showing the storefront before rehabilitation. The storefront had been altered, the transom had been filled in, and the tin ceiling had been covered over. And then we can move on to the after shot, where we've restored the arched multi-light transom and the tin ceiling, but no changes were needed to be made to the building approach. You can see that the path slopes upward from the sidewalk at grade up to the front entries. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that there's no step up into the space. So step 2 is assessing the property's existing and required level of accessibility. Well, it's accessible from grade. So we have that going for us. And if we go to the next slide, showing the interior of the main floor, we had to evaluate the accessibility options within a preservation context. Well, we had maintained accessibility by the arrangement of furnishings. And if we move to the next slide, we can see that the path of travel is unencumbered, unimpeded through those front doors, which are wide enough for a wheelchair to gain access and go through the space, proceed through to the point of service and to the recovery room, because this is a vertical runner store, and they wanted a place for runners to gather and before and after and their runs, and be able to use the fitting rooms, the restrooms, and some locker space. So you can see stairs out of the rear of the of the building. Now, wheelchairs obviously cannot get down these stairs, but that's okay. There's a landing that's accessible should they want to get some fresh air. And there's these new stairs on the right, have a proper rise and run, guardrails, handrails, and extensions beyond the top and bottom steps to hang on to. Case study number 2 is the Wayne Agency Building in Cuyahoga Falls, which is just north of Akron in Northeast Ohio. It's a 4-bay, 2-story brick commercial building. You can see the middle bays are shown here in this historic photo from the 1920s. The Wayne Agency was a business dealing in mortgage loans, fire insurance, and real estate. And this building was recently rehabilitated, also using state and federal historic rehabilitation tax credits. And the end uses was not a change in use. It was still going to be commercial space and on the first and second floors. So step 1 in that National Park Service process of assessment is reviewing the historical significance of the property and identifying the character defining features. The Wayne Agency Building is contributing to the Cuyahoga Falls Downtown Historic District. This 1920s photo shows the middle bays of the 4-bay building with the character defining features on the exterior as the brick masonry walls, the tripartite wood windows on the second floor, and the wood storefronts on the first floor. Now, if we go to the next slide, we'll see that the storefront between the brick piers have been altered and would need to be reinstated. And most prominently, those northern 2 bays have a mansard roof that was instated in the 70s. So the whole facade has been covered over. So using a pipeline grant through the State Historic Preservation Office, we were able to remove the mansard and facade and reveal the brick intact beneath, showing it retained historic integrity and that the building as a whole does indeed contribute to the historic district. Now, this slide shows that access to the front in the facade would require stepping up into the building. You can see by that yellow arrow. So that would have to be addressed if we were to make this building accessible. The entry bays also do not meet ADA, but the second floor is on grade behind the building. So even the second floor is actually accessible. So that's a good thing. The next slide shows the final result with the storefronts, windows, and parapets reinstated. And if we move to the next slide, yes, here, step 3, evaluating the accessibility options within a preservation context, you can see that the challenge was to have the front storefronts, the 4 storefronts accessible. And we had the option of either introducing sloped, angled display window walls, which is the option we chose, but we had to bring the entry point forward to the exterior to make room for a wide enough door for a wheelchair to go through and a side light for the pole handle requirement. So if you go to the next slide, you will see just that. And the historic tile remains, and there was a nice slope already into the building on this particular storefront and an unimpeded path through the space. And this is currently a sweet shop. And this is another storefront, another retail business, which is a salon. And you can see that the historic tile, pointed out by that blue arrow, is maintained, even though the entry point has been moved forward. Okay, so we were able to move through the prominent public entrances and have a path to the entrance and provide access to the goods, services, and programs. Next slide, please, is case study number 3, the Stuyvesant Motor Company building on Prospect Avenue in downtown Cleveland. It's a block south from the Euclid Avenue Historic District and just a couple blocks east of the Lower Prospect Huron Historic District. So it wasn't within either of those districts or individually listed. So we were going to have to list that individually on the National Register of Historic Places in order to take advantage and be eligible for state and federal historic tax credits. So this is an image from around 1962 showing the intact character defining features, the wood storefronts flanking a garage door on the first floor, the large industrial steel sash on floors 2 through 5 that are within your nice brick masonry walls of this 3-bay, 5-story building that was constructed in 1917 as a sales showroom, service center, garage, and storage facility. So it had an industrial use, and it was going to be converted to residences. So there was going to be a change of occupancy, and we were able to utilize the historic rehabilitation tax credits, in both offered by the feds and the state, also as well as the low income housing tax credits to make this a parking on the lower floors and 42 income eligible workforce apartments on the upper floors. So if you move to the next slide, yes, this is the arrow pointing, go back, the arrow pointing to the historic angled entry that would have to be reinstated because of the second slide, if we go to the next slide, shows that the storefronts and the garage were infilled with brick, and the top floor has also been infilled. So this is in construction close to the final product. Note the reinstated industrial sash replicated in aluminum with insulated glass units for comfort of the residents, and reinstated storefronts and garage door. So if we look at some plans of the proposal to restore the entry, you can see how the existing before rehabilitation walls, shaded in red, would not be wide enough to accommodate a wheelchair comfortably. And the next slide shows that that angled storefront, that historic angled storefront, was able to be reintroduced with enough pull side for entry into the space through the pedestrian entry. So because of the funding source, this project was also subject to meeting universal design requirements and HUD's 504, in addition to the Ohio Building Code and the ANSI standards in the building code. So we had to get residents, pedestrians up into the residential levels, and we were able to do that because of the the conversion of the former automobile elevator space, which is pointed out by that blue arrow. And the space, the elevator actually went all the way back to the rear of the building, but we were able to take the front of that space and make it a passenger elevator. And if we move to the next slide, we can see the finished exterior pedestrian entry and a finished unit with a beautiful view to downtown Cleveland. And in summary, we were able to make the prominent public entrances accessible, including a path to the entrance, provide access to the goods, services, and programs, which was provided through that elevator getting up to the residential floor units, and providing access to the restroom facilities, and creating access to the amenities in the secondary spaces. So these 3 case studies show how buildings listed on the National Register can be rehabilitated and both follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation and meet accessibility requirements. Thank you. These are some handy resources that you will find in your handout on the right side of the screen. And I think Elizabeth wants to talk about this quote.
Yes, the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So we've thrown an awful lot of things at you today, and we would just like to open it up to questions to see if we can't maybe make some things clearer that we've left muddy.
Thank you so much. It's a lot of information. Please go to the question box on your right side panel and type in any questions you have. Also, if you need the AIA credits, go to the chat box and there's a link for you to fill out a form there. And of course, you can see the handout of this presentation. So the first question we have is about the Faber building, and you might want to slide back to that slide. I don't know, Polly. On the Faber building, how did you avoid complying with the latch side clearances?
Okay, on the Faber building, Polly, if you can find the front entry picture, it will be easy to explain. So on the Faber, it's not moving? Okay, don't worry about it. So the Faber building, there were two doors that were plenty wide enough, and the piece that was between them actually had a little bit of a slope back out to the towards the street, and that slope was enough that it allowed a wheelchair to maneuver there more easily. Also, because it's an historic building, you are allowed to discuss with the building code officials, does this work or does this not work? And the code actually says that that things can be turned over to the discretion of the building code official. So some things, when they're large, the building code officials are not comfortable with finding an alternative method to meet the requirement. But in those cases, you sometimes have to file a formal appeal and then have somebody look at it. But in cases like this, where it came really close to meeting the requirement and there were two doors there and everything else met the requirements, then the building code official saw that that was a good attempt and we made it safer and easier for people to get in, and he allowed it to go by. I hope that's a good answer.
Okay, just if the questioner, Nina, if you have more questions, just add it in there. She says thank you. The next question, which we might need more information, if our rehabilitation project is on the second floor, do we need to have ADA access to the second floor?
Okay, well, that's kind of a loaded question, but if you're only spending money on the second floor and you're not spending money on the first floor, then you're going to have some questions asked. For instance, if you were putting in new apartments or new offices, then you would likely be required to make the restrooms up there be accessible according to the code. But if it's a small building like Vertical Runner, you would not be necessarily required to put in an elevator. Let's see, if you were putting in residences and they were new, then it depends a little bit on your funding source. If it's federal funding, then you would be required to make at least one of the restrooms and one of the units be accessible. Remember, accessibility covers a lot of things, and it's not just a wheelchair. So we have to think about the fact that the accessibility requirements don't just mean getting a wheelchair up the stairs. So if you're working on a second floor only, then you would likely have to make anything that you did new meet the requirements, but you wouldn't necessarily have to put in an elevator.
Okay, we have a little bit more elaboration on that question. It's the rehabilitation of a ballroom below an opera house upstairs. Can we rehabilitate downstairs and ignore the upstairs for now?
Yes. In fact, that's what Vertical Runner did. They decided they only had a specific amount of money that they wanted to spend, so they spent it on fixing the roof, on fixing the facade, and on making sure the first floor and the basement were clean and usable for the Vertical Runner business. And they decided to let the residential units that exist on the second and third floor remain untouched for now.
Okay, we have a longer question here. For the Wayne building, the number 2 case study, you were able to remove the mansard roof as it was in addition in the 70s. I've come across cases where we've had to keep previous renovations because it was determined that those alterations had to be protected too. Why are some alterations able to be demoed while others preserved?
Well, that's a very good question, because you know, you and I look at that 70s mansard and you think, oh, that's awful. But it really did sort of represent the trend at the time. So at some point, are we going to say that this is a historic building worth saving? So that's a question you always have to have in the back of your mind. The Secretary of the Interior standards do have a standard that says you must respect the changes to the building over time. So it becomes part of your initial thought process when you are looking at what is historically significant and what shows the integrity of this building. And I would love to tell you there's an easy answer for that, but there is not. You will often have to go back and forth in your own head about whether or not the additions that are put on a building or the changes to the building are significant enough to warrant their keeping. Usually, it's in your favor to address things that have already changed, because you're not required to change anything that's already there. So, for instance, if it was deemed that the Wayne Agency building was historic and that roof was there, you could leave it. However, the question of integrity came up before that question did. So, but you often will run into a Main Street building where the facade has changed, and if you are addressing the inside or the second floor, like the first questioner, could you leave the first floor? Yes, you can leave it there, even if it's not exactly historically correct. The thing is, when you do touch it, then you must make it more compatible with the historic.
If I can interject.
Oh, yes.
If I can interject, sorry. It also depends what the period of significance is for the listed building. So I believe this mansard roof alteration occurred after the period of significance.
Good point. Good point. So a period of significance example I can give you. We did a restoration on a Frank Lloyd Wright house, and there was an addition on the back of that. But it was determined that the period of significance only related to the family living in the house who originally had it designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. So everything after 1928 that was added or changed had to be taken off. And that discussion didn't come from the building department, and it didn't come from the Park Service. It came from the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy. That was their determination. If Wright didn't do it, it's coming off.
Okay. For multiple storefronts with steps up along sloped frontage, does accessibility lead to recessing all the entries and losing rentable area in each store? for hilly areas, there are often several steps at the storefront.
Yeah, that's a tough one. The answer is you got to think about it up front in your scope of work. So for instance, one person owns a Wayne agency building and there's 4 properties there, or 4 storefronts there. And that street slopes not very much at this point. But if you had those where the slope is drastic, how do you address it? So sometimes you can address it at each store level and sometimes you can't. And the recesses in these buildings were original. So they weren't recessed on purpose. They were recessed originally, and then we were able to take advantage of the little bit of slope that came from the sidewalk to the front because we were only dealing with one step. So sometimes you end up having to address accessibility from a different direction. So if you had 4 storefronts in a row, can they share a common entry that's accessible? Can you access them from the back of the building? There's all sorts of things that you can think about, and because you got to look at practicality. If you had a building like the Wayne Agency that's a 0 lot line, and the storefront was all the way to the street, and it had 6 steps, what do you do? And those are very good questions, and each one of them has to be looked at individually.
Okay, the next question. If we are putting residences on a 3rd floor that currently has access by an ancient elevator, do we need to retrofit this so that it is to ADA standards?
If you're talking about the ancient elevator, remember when I was talking about elevators, I said you want to think about, can you keep the elevator? So if your residents are on the 3rd floor and your elevator is not required, then no, you only have to make sure that your elevator meets elevator code for health and safety.
Okay, and please ask any follow-ups if you have them. The next question. In our 1890 2-story opera house, our roof is collapsing. Can we focus on the roof and 2nd floor area only and wait on the 1st floor?
Yes. Now, I say yes as though the answer is really simple. From what I glean from your question, yes, the answer is yes. You can look at the roof and whatever damage is on the 2nd floor. But I would caution you also to think about what you want to do to the 2nd floor so that you're not having to spend money later to undo things you did to the 2nd floor because they weren't carefully thought out. You want to make sure that if you are going to need access, how are you going to do it? Even if you don't do it now, you have to think about those things. But there is absolutely nothing that should stop you from repairing your roof. First of all, nothing should stop you from being able to repair your roof and to make a building safer. A lot of times that's the determinant. Are we making the building safer than it is now? Safer, more accessible.
We have a lull in questions, so I have a question for you, Elizabeth. If you can kind of clarify, I think in terms of historic tax credits being federal money, but they really are treated differently in ADA accessibility as compared to a federal grant, right?
Depends on which grant it is, but no, they're not. The accessibility now is much more focused within the building code. Okay, so the requirements end up being a lot similar. Now, if you are getting, so again, a lot of this depends on scale. So for instance, if you got a HUD grant, through Housing and Urban Development, because you had already had an historic building that had, let's say, 30 units in it, you're exceeding their threshold of 15 units. So they are going to have a higher level of requirement than you would if you had a storefront building with 2 or 3 stories and only 2 or 3 apartments. So there's a level shift with size.
Which is true whether it's grants or historic tax credits then, because it goes back to the building code too.
Yes, yes. Now, if you remember that I talked a little bit about Section 504. Now, in Section 504, it has specific thresholds for size in it. So, and that is often with HUD. So when we've done low-income housing tax credits, we have to meet the whole alphabet soup. 504, Universal Design, ADA, ABA, Ohio Building Code, and we have to be able to dance all those tunes. If we're looking at, now we've also done a low-income housing project that's connected to a 3-story storefront. So you're still looking at the 3-story storefront as an historic building that's only 3 stories. And you're able to address the requirements that pertain specifically within the code to a building of only 3 stories. Does that help?
Yes. Yes. So I don't have any other questions in yet. Please type them in as I do some ending comments. I certainly want to thank Elizabeth and Alice for sharing their expertise with us. For all of you still listening to us, please consider getting professional advice. It's so important to having a good project. Here we have a good question that came in. With historic properties, we're often modest in the color of new work. Black replacement window frames that were maybe green originally. Could you talk about appropriate color and contrast that may be contemporary?
Oh, that's a good question. So I am one who is in favor of the proper use of color. I think that a lot of people feel that it's safe to use black, but there's a lot of research that shows what colors were used in a specific time period. So we find that if we want to address a building with color, then we look to the time period and make our case for using color on a building. Now, I've seen some buildings that would have been, because of when they were built, they would have been earth tone colors, and people have painted them with purple and green. And because I know the difference, I find the purple and green upsetting. It's not that it was a bad color. It's that I know it's not historically correct. So I'm not quite sure if that's what the questioner is asking me, but it seems to me that it's a good idea, if you like color, to research what the building could have looked like and propose color to go with it, instead of always, like you said, playing it safe.
Okay, I'll still read questions as they come in. Again, if you need AIA credits, link to the chat box and fill that form out. It's automatic. Heritage Ohio's next webinar will be Wednesday, November 18th at 1 p.m., dealing with decorative plaster, which also has AIA HSW credits. You can find our other webinars upcoming on our website at heritageohio.org. December 2nd at 10 a.m., there will be an application workshop for the Main Street communities who are eligible for the Paul Brunn grant. At 1 p.m. on December 2nd, we will be having Winter City, a webinar about making your city accessible and entertaining to people during the winter months from our friends in Edmonton, Canada. So I don't see any other questions coming in. That was a whole lot of information. Elizabeth, Alice, thank you so much for the webinar. A lot of nice comments coming in, and we really appreciate your support in providing this information to us.
Oh, you're welcome. I hope you learned just a little bit out of all of that.
You bet.
I really hope that we're able to put some people's minds at ease so that they can understand that the depth of work that needs to be done, the breadth of work that needs to be done with accessibility depends entirely on how much work you're doing, and you can control it.
Okay, thank you, and goodbye to everyone till next time.
Thanks, Joyce.
Thanks, Joyce.